Welcome to the News Review on Press TV. A hospital is targeted in militants' latest attack on government-held areas in Syria's southern province of Daraa. 2 civilians, including a child, were killed when 4 Bagh militants targeted the provincial capital with mortar shells. 3 others were also injured in the attack, and this after the Syrian military launched an offensive on terrorist hideouts in Daraa. Damascus saying the offensive was in response to the militants' refusal to surrender under a deal reached in 2018. The Syrian Army liberated the southern province 3 years ago, but some areas still remain under militants' control. Okay, let's see what's happening in Syria. So joining me will be a couple of guests. Our correspondent in Damascus, Mohammed is there, and also we have Vanessa Beeley, resistance journalist, also in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Good to have you with us both. Mohammed, let's start with you. Give us an update on the situation, what's going on. 3 years ago, Daraa was liberated, but still we have some pockets of terrorist militants operating there against the government.
Yes, in 2018, the Syrian army took control of Daraa and its countryside, and there were various areas in which there were armed groups that did not refuse to sign a reconciliation deal with the Syrian army, surrender their weapons, and have security restored, and government institutions working back in those areas. However, in Daraa al-Balad, over there are still some various armed groups that refuse to surrender their weapons. And just about 2 or 3 days ago, there was reports about a deal reached after negotiations and talks between some notables and representatives of the armed groups over there in Daraa al-Balad in particular, and the Syrian army, in which a new reconciliation deal was reached. But today, some of those armed groups, some of those terrorists perhaps, some say that the reports say that there are over there some Daesh members, those refused again to surrender their weapons, and thus what happened was that the Syrian army deployed its troops around Daraa al-Balad, and in response those terrorists fired mortar shells at government-held parts of Daraa governorate. Particularly one hit the national hospital in Daraa and the other in al-Sahali quarter. Those mortar attacks, according to head of the national hospital of Daraa, led to the killing of 2 civilians, 1 is a child, and the injury of 3 others. We don't know what will happen, but if we look back at other similar parts of Syria that witnessed similar cases, when terrorists refuse to surrender their arms and continue to attack civilian areas, the army carries out an offensive and secures the area.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, Vanessa, let's have your assessment of the situation in Syria. Why do we still have some militants, taking even civilian lives and threatening civilian lives? And hasn't the Damascus government been too patient?
I mean, in Daraa, the situation has been extremely delicate since the negotiations that Mohammed mentioned in 2018 that were brokered really by Russia. But in 2018, I actually entered Daraa al-Balad shortly after the negotiations were still finishing. And by chance, I actually met with one of the leaders of the armed groups then, Adam al-Qad, who was assassinated actually last year. Mm-hmm. He spoke to me about the fact that the armed groups were never going to surrender to the Syrian government. So there was clearly a continued, let's say, armed opposition to the Syrian government and, of course, to amnesty and reconciliation and reintegration into Syrian society at that point. So and then, of course, we've had a series of assassinations of let's say, who they consider to be government loyalists, but those include doctors, dentists, government workers in Daraa that have been assassinated since 2018 by the armed groups. We also have to remember that in March 2020, a British Special Forces, an SAS soldier, was airlifted out of southern Syria, having been injured by an IED. And following the Integrity Initiative documents, also, it's clear that there is still a British intelligence presence in southern Syria, and I think it's safe to conclude that they are involved in the maintenance of the armed resistance against peace and against the Syrian government.
Vanessa, you rightly mentioned the UK's intelligence presence there. What about the US? Where is the US in this? Would they let go of those oil rigs in Syria?
Absolutely not. And we also have to remember, of course, that the US base, the Al-Tanf base, the illegal occupation base, is effectively training and recruiting terrorists, including ISIS, of course, in the 55-kilometer no-go zone around Al-Tanf, where they're running military exercises. So between the UK and the US, I would say the US coalition. I don't know if Mohammed can clarify if weapons have still been coming in from Jordanian territory to those armed groups in Daraa, and that are still, you know, the fighting cells that still exist in southern Syria. I don't have any clear information on that, but I would assume that that's a possibility.
Yeah, if I could go back to Mohammed and ask him, Mohammed, you said that there was another offer by the government for the militants to lay down their arms 3-4 days ago. So is it clear if this doesn't happen, we will have an offensive against them?
Well, I think there will be two cases. If those terrorist groups refuse to surrender their weapons, I think they will have two choices on the table. One, get out via buses, just like what we've seen before in eastern Al-Ghouta, for example, near Damascus. Terrorists who refused to surrender their arms, they left safely via buses to Idlib. This will be one option. The other option will be to surrender. If they refuse both options, I believe, looking back at what happened during the Syrian war, I believe the Syrian army will carry out military operations. Why the Syrian army gives a chance to those armed groups to surrender their weapons or get out to Idlib is because there are civilians still inside those areas that they occupy, and because the Syrian army and the Syrian government wants the civilians to be safe, they propose such solutions to the terrorists. Unless, of course, if there were no civilians, we would have seen the Syrian army squashing them, just like we've seen that before in other parts of the country where there were only terrorists. So we have to wait and see what will happen, but definitely the Syrian army is determined to secure this area in order to have the civilian lives in government-held parts of Daraa secured, because as long as there are terrorists there, we will continue to see mortar attacks, we will continue to see attacks on Syrian checkpoints and positions, we will continue to see explosive devices planted on roads over there. So it's the Syrian army's duty, according to the constitution, to eliminate terrorist threats and secure every part of Syria, and this is, I believe, what we will be seeing in Daraa if they refuse to surrender their arms, those armed groups.
Okay, now we're in the picture. Thank you very much for that. Mohammed Ali, our correspondent, and also Vanessa Beeley, resistant journalist, joining us from Damascus with our contribution. And that's it for this edition of the News Review.